What happens when an arrogant lawyer challenges a brilliant judge in her own courtroom? In this gripping tale of justice, one man's ego meets its match, and the result will leave you speechless. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet anticipation as people shuffled into their seats. In the heart of New York City, a high-profile corporate fraud case was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The defendant, a wealthy businessman accused of embezzling millions from small investors, had spared no expense in hiring David Bryant, a defense attorney known as much for his arrogance as for his dramatic courtroom tactics. David entered the courtroom with the air of someone who owned the place. His expensive navy blue suit was perfectly tailored, and he carried a leather briefcase that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He made a deliberate show of setting it down on the defense table, his movements slow and exaggerated, as though daring anyone to underestimate him. Seated at the bench was Judge Eleanor Hayes, a woman whose mere presence commanded respect. In her late 50s, she had spent decades on the bench, earning a reputation for her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to justice. Her steel-gray hair was tied back neatly, and her piercing blue eyes swept over the courtroom as she prepared to begin. Judge Hayes was known for her fairness, but also for her firmness, qualities that often clashed with personalities like David's. As the court came to order, David leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. His client sat beside him, nervously adjusting his tie, but David barely acknowledged him. His attention was focused on the judge, sizing her up like an opponent in a game he had already decided he would win. "Good morning, counsel," Judge Hayes began, her tone professional but firm. "We are here today to address the charges of fraud and embezzlement brought against Mr. Raymond Foster. I trust all parties are ready to proceed?" David stood, buttoning his jacket with an air of practiced precision. "Ready, Your Honor," he said smoothly, though his tone carried a hint of condescension. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow but said nothing, motioning for the prosecution to begin. As the trial commenced, David wasted no time making his presence known. He interrupted the prosecution's opening statement twice, objecting to points that were clearly valid. His interruptions weren't about substance, they were about control, a tactic to rattle his opponents and assert dominance. The prosecutor, a composed woman named Susan Caldwell, maintained her focus, but the tension in the room was palpable. Judge Hayes remained silent, allowing David enough rope to reveal his true intentions. By the end of the opening arguments, David's confidence had grown. He smirked at his client as if to say, "We've got this in the bag." But he had underestimated the judge, whose patience was not infinite. The courtroom settled into the rhythm of the trial. But David Bryant had no intention of playing by anyone's rules, especially not Judge Hayes's. From the moment the prosecutor began presenting her case, David's arrogance seeped into every aspect of his behavior. When Susan Caldwell introduced her first piece of evidence, a series of forged documents linked to David's client, he rose from his seat before she could finish. "Objection, Your Honor," he declared, his voice booming through the courtroom. "These documents are irrelevant to the case at hand." Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow, her tone calm but clipped. "Mr. Bryant, the prosecution has barely begun presenting their evidence. Please allow them to proceed." David smirked, leaning slightly on the defense table. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't dream of interrupting unnecessarily," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. The prosecutor continued, but the tension was palpable. Every few minutes, David would mutter something under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Amateur hour," he whispered once, shaking his head theatrically. Susan paused briefly, glancing toward Judge Hayes, who motioned for her to continue. The courtroom audience exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort growing as David's behavior became increasingly blatant. By the time the prosecution called its first witness, a former employee of the defendant, David's antics had reached a boiling point. The witness, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, detailed how his boss had manipulated company finances, leaving employees and investors in financial ruin. David stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. "Let me save everyone some time," he said, waving a dismissive hand toward the witness. "This man clearly has a vendetta against my client. Let's not pretend his testimony is unbiased. The gallery gasped at his audacity. Judge Hayes tapped her gavel once, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Mr. Bryant, you will address the court respectfully or risk being held in contempt. But David wasn't done. He leaned on the podium, fixing the witness with a predatory smile. Tell me, sir, he began, his tone patronizing, how much were you paid to sit here and lie about my client? The witness stammered, clearly rattled. The prosecutor objected immediately. Your Honor, the defense is badgering the witness. Judge Hayes nodded. Sustained. Mr. Bryant, one more outburst like that and I will not hesitate to take action. Do I make myself clear? David's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Crystal clear, Your Honor, he said, bowing slightly in mock deference. The trial continued, but David's disruptive behavior persisted. He interrupted the prosecution's second witness, rolled his eyes during key testimony, and even muttered audibly while Judge Hayes delivered rulings. The gallery grew restless, sensing the escalating tension between the defense attorney and the judge. The breaking point came during a discussion about admissible evidence. Judge Hayes began outlining her reasoning for allowing a key piece of prosecution evidence when David interrupted. With all due respect, Your Honor, he said, his voice tinged with derision. It's clear you're not familiar with the finer points of corporate law. Perhaps a refresher course would help. The courtroom fell silent. Even David's client glanced at him, his expression a mix of confusion and worry. Judge Hayes lowered her glasses slightly, meeting David's gaze with an icy calm. Mr. Bryant, she said evenly, I suggest you tread carefully. This is my final warning. David, emboldened by the attention, shrugged. I'm just saying, Your Honor. The law is complex and not everyone has the expertise to interpret it correctly. The tension in the room was electric. Spectators exchanged nervous glances and even the stenographer hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys. Judge Hayes remained composed, though a flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, crossed her face. She adjusted her glasses, her voice steady. Mr. Bryant, your remarks are noted. Please sit down so we can proceed with the trial. David returned to his seat, but his behavior didn't improve. By the afternoon session, his interruptions had become so frequent that even the jury began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. During one particularly heated exchange, David accused the prosecutor of fabricating evidence, an accusation so baseless that it drew audible gasps from the gallery. Judge Hayes finally stood, her expression unreadable, but her voice firm. Mr. Bryant, approach the bench. David hesitated for the first time, his confidence faltering slightly, but he complied. As he stood before the judge, she leaned forward, her tone quiet but unyielding. This is your final opportunity to conduct yourself professionally. Do not test my patience again, or you will face consequences. David nodded, his bravado muted for the moment. Understood, Your Honor, he said, though the glint in his eyes suggested he wasn't finished yet. The afternoon session concluded with tension hanging thick in the air. As the courtroom emptied, spectators whispered about what they had witnessed. He's digging his own grave, one woman murmured to her companion. Another added, that judge has the patience of a saint, but even she has her limits. For the first time, David began to feel the weight of his actions, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as the trial entered its second day. David Bryant, undeterred by the warnings from Judge Hayes, seemed determined to push the boundaries even further. His antics, which had initially shocked and irritated the courtroom, now began to verge on outright disrespect. As the prosecution presented its third witness, a forensic accountant who had uncovered fraudulent transfers in the defendant's company, David couldn't resist making his presence known. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through papers noisily, a deliberate effort to distract the witness. When the prosecutor asked the accountant to explain a key transaction, David muttered loudly. Amateur hour, as usual. Judge Hayes's gaze flicked toward him, but she remained composed. The witness continued, detailing how the defendant had funneled investor money into personal offshore accounts. It was damning evidence, and the gallery murmured as the numbers were projected onto the screen. David stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. This so-called expert is speculating. None of this proves my client's intent. Judge Hayes raised her hand to silence the murmurs. Overruled, she said firmly. The witness may continue. David scoffed, shaking his head theatrically. Of course, Your Honor. Why let the facts get in the way? The gallery gasped at his audacity. Judge Hayes tapped her gavel once, her voice sharp. Mr. Bryant, approach the bench. David hesitated, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. When he finally complied, Judge Hayes spoke quietly but firmly. Your comment was inappropriate and borders on contempt. I suggest you choose your words more carefully moving forward. David smirked. I'm just expressing my opinion, Your Honor. Judge Hayes's gaze hardened. Your opinions have no place in this courtroom. Do not test me again. The trial resumed, but the tension between David and Judge Hayes was unmistakable. The final straw came during the prosecution's closing arguments. Susan Caldwell was summarizing the evidence, emphasizing the harm caused by the defendant's actions. David interrupted, laughing loudly. Oh, spare us the theatrics, he said, waving dismissively. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hayes stood, her voice cutting through the air. Mr. Bryant, approach the bench immediately. David reluctantly complied, his smirk fading as he met her gaze. Mr. Bryant, she began, her tone cold, you have disrespected this court, disrupted these proceedings, and undermined the integrity of this trial. Your behavior is unacceptable. David opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Hayes raised her hand. I am holding you in contempt of court. You will pay a fine, and further disruptions will result in additional penalties. Return to your seat. David's face flushed with anger, but he obeyed. The gallery remained silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. As the day ended, the courtroom emptied, leaving David alone at the defense table. For the first time, he looked uncertain, his confidence shaken by Judge Hayes's unwavering authority. The trial resumed the following day, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was noticeably different. Judge Hayes, after tolerating David Bryant's disruptive behavior for far too long, had decided that enough was enough. Her calm and measured demeanor remained intact, but there was a steely resolve in her gaze that signaled a shift in the proceedings. As the court came to order, David's arrogance seemed undiminished. He sat at the defense table, rifling through his papers with exaggerated flair, as though preparing to deliver the performance of his career. His client, however, appeared far less confident, his nervous glances at Judge Hayes betraying a growing awareness of the dire situation. The prosecution resumed its argument, introducing the final pieces of evidence, bank statements and correspondence that left little doubt about the defendant's guilt. The documents showed a clear pattern of embezzlement, with funds being funneled through shell companies into personal accounts. David stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. Objection, Your Honor, he declared, his voice loud and forceful. These documents are irrelevant and prejudicial. The prosecution is trying to distract the jury from the real issues. Judge Hayes tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Mr. Bryant, she said evenly, the relevance of these documents has already been established. Your objection is overruled. Please sit down. David hesitated, his jaw tightening. With all due respect, Your Honor, he began, his tone heavy with sarcasm. I believe the court is making a mistake by allowing this evidence. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp and unyielding. Mr. Bryant, the only mistake being made here is your continued disregard for courtroom decorum. You will sit down and allow the prosecution to proceed, or I will take further action." The gallery was silent, the tension in the room palpable. David's face flushed with anger, but he reluctantly returned to his seat. The prosecution continued, laying out the final arguments with precision and clarity. When it was David's turn to present his closing argument, he strode to the podium with the same overconfidence that had marked his behavior throughout the trial. He began by attempting to discredit the evidence, dismissing the emails, bank statements, and witness testimony as circumstantial. "This entire case," he declared, gesturing toward the prosecution, "is built on speculation and misinterpretation. My client is a successful businessman who has been targeted simply because of his wealth and success." He paused, turning to address the jury directly. "Ask yourselves this. Would you want to live in a world where success is punished and ambition is treated as a crime?" The jury remained impassive, their expressions giving nothing away. Judge Hayes watched closely, her pen poised over her notes. David's argument grew more theatrical as he continued, his voice rising with each point. "This trial isn't about justice," he proclaimed. "It's about envy, about punishing those who dare to rise above the rest. And it's about a court that has failed to remain impartial." Judge Hayes's gaze sharpened, but she let him continue, her calm composure unbroken. David turned toward her, a smug smile on his face. "Isn't that right, Your Honor? Perhaps you'd like to explain to the jury why you've allowed this circus to continue." A gasp rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor glanced at Judge Hayes, her expression a mix of disbelief and concern. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsettled by David's audacity. Judge Hayes tapped her gavel once, the sharp sound cutting through the murmurs. "Mr. Bryant," she said, her tone icy, "you have crossed the line for the final time." David opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Hayes held up a hand to silence him. "I have allowed you far more leniency than your behavior warrants. Your disrespect for this court, your baseless accusations, and your repeated attempts to derail these proceedings are unacceptable." She turned her attention to the jury, her voice steady and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are here to decide this case based on the evidence and the law, not on the theatrics of counsel." Addressing the gallery, she continued, "The courtroom is a place of order and respect, and those who fail to uphold these principles will face consequences." She fixed her gaze on David, her expression unwavering. "Mr. Bryant, you are held in contempt of court. You will pay a fine of $5,000, and any further disruptions will result in more severe penalties." David's face turned red, his bravado finally cracking. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "You can't silence me just because you don't like what I have to say." Judge Hayes remained calm, her voice cutting through his outburst like a knife. "Mr. Bryant, this is not about silencing you. It is about ensuring that justice is served and that this court is respected. Now, return to your seat, or I will have you removed." Defeated, David slumped back into his chair, his confidence shattered. The gallery watched in silence, the tension giving way to a sense of awe. Judge Hayes turned her attention back to the proceedings, her focus unwavering. With her authority firmly re-established, the trial moved forward with renewed order. The jury, now free from David's distractions, listened intently as Judge Hayes summarized the key points of the case. Her clarity and precision left no room for doubt, her words resonating with a quiet power that reminded everyone in the room why she was so highly regarded. By the end of the day, the tone of the trial had shifted entirely. David's theatrics had been replaced by a palpable sense of justice, and Judge Hayes's leadership stood as a testament to the strength of integrity and professionalism. The final day of the trial arrived, and the air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Spectators filled every seat, their murmurs hushed as the jury filed into place. For weeks, They had witnessed David Bryant's theatrics and Judge Hayes's quiet but commanding presence. Now all attention was on the jury, who held the power to determine the fate of the wealthy businessman on trial for corporate fraud. Judge Hayes entered the courtroom with her usual composure, her black robe flowing behind her as she ascended to the bench. She surveyed the room briefly before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer, stood and cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." David Bryant leaned back in his chair, feigning confidence. His client, however, was visibly anxious, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The prosecutor, Susan Caldwell, sat upright, her expression calm but expectant. The foreman unfolded the slip of paper in his hand. "In the case of the State versus Raymond Foster, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by hushed murmurs. David's smirk vanished instantly. His client slumped in his seat, his face ashen. Susan Caldwell allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. Judge Hayes raised her gavel, the sharp crack silencing the murmurs. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice steady. She turned to the jury. "Thank you for your service. You are dismissed." As the jury exited, the tension in the room shifted toward the bench. It was time for Judge Hayes to deliver the sentencing. She turned her attention to the defendant, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Foster, you have been found guilty of embezzling millions of dollars from hard-working families and small businesses. Your actions have caused irreparable harm to countless lives, and this court will hold you accountable." David stood, his voice ringing out in desperation. "Your Honor, I move for a mistrial. The jury was biased, and this entire process has been unfair to my client." Judge Hayes raised her hand, silencing him with a single, deliberate gesture. "Mr. Bryant, your objections have been noted and dismissed. Please, sit down." David hesitated, his arrogance faltering under the weight of her authority, but he obeyed. The courtroom watched in rapt silence as Judge Hayes continued. "Mr. Foster," she said, her tone firm, "you will serve 25 years in federal prison, the maximum allowable sentence for your crimes. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution to all your victims, totaling $10.2 million with interest." The defendant's head dropped, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. But Judge Hayes wasn't finished. She turned her attention to David. "Mr. Bryant," she began, her voice sharp enough to cut through the stillness, "your conduct during this trial has been nothing short of appalling. Your repeated interruptions, baseless accusations, and blatant disrespect for this court have undermined the principles of justice you claim to uphold." David opened his mouth to speak, but she continued before he could interrupt. "You are an officer of the court, and with that title comes responsibility. Your behavior has not only harmed your client, but has cast a shadow over the integrity of this trial." She paused, letting her words sink in. The gallery was utterly silent, every eye fixed on the judge. "As a result," she said, "I am referring your conduct to the State Bar Association for review. Further, you are fined an additional $10,000 for your contemptuous behavior in this courtroom. Let this serve as a lesson to you and to anyone who believes arrogance and disrespect have a place in the pursuit of justice." David's face turned crimson, his confidence shattered. For the first time during the trial, he was speechless. Judge Hayes rose from the bench, her presence commanding as she delivered her final words. "This court stands for accountability, fairness, and respect, values that are non-negotiable. This trial is adjourned." The sharp strike of her gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of the proceedings. As the bailiff approached the defendant to escort him out, the gallery began to stir. A quiet murmur of approval swept through the spectators. Near the front row, an elderly man who had lost his savings to the defendant leaned toward his daughter. "That judge," he whispered. "She didn't just deliver justice, she restored it." In the back, one of the defendant's former employees wiped away tears, her expression a mixture of relief and vindication. "Finally," she murmured to the person beside her, "he's being held accountable." David slumped into his chair, his head bowed as the weight of his defeat settled over him. His once flamboyant demeanor had been replaced by quiet humiliation. Outside the courthouse, reporters eagerly waited to capture reactions. Susan Caldwell emerged with a quiet smile, declining interviews but clearly satisfied with the outcome. Minutes later, Judge Hayes stepped out, her calm expression unchanged. A reporter called out, "Judge Hayes, any comment on the trial?" She paused briefly, looking into the cameras with quiet determination. "Justice isn't about theatrics or ego. It's about truth, fairness, and accountability. Let this case remind us all of that." With those words, she walked away, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Inside the courthouse, the echoes of her gavel still lingered, a testament to the power of integrity in the face of arrogance. The trial's conclusion sent ripples far beyond the walls of the courthouse. News outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it as both a legal and moral reckoning. Headlines like, "Wealthy fraudster sentenced to 25 years and arrogant lawyer faces bar review after disrespecting judge" dominated the evening news. But the fallout for David Bryant and his client was far from over. David returned to his office that evening, his confidence thoroughly shaken. The bravado he had displayed throughout the trial had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the mountain of paperwork piled in front of him. Emails from clients filled his inbox, some expressing outrage over his conduct in court and others quietly severing ties with his firm. By the following week, David's law firm was already feeling the impact. High-profile clients began withdrawing their cases, citing a lack of trust in his professionalism. David's colleagues, once deferential to his charm and connections, now avoided him in the hallways. Even his longtime assistant handed in her resignation, leaving a note on his desk that read, "I can't work for someone who disrespects the very foundation of our profession." As David faced the collapse of his career, Judge Eleanor Hayes's reputation soared. Legal analysts praised her poise and authority, with one commentator describing her as the embodiment of justice. Online forums buzzed with discussions about her handling of the trial, with many lauding her ability to maintain control in the face of David's relentless disrespect. In the days following the trial, Judge Hayes received dozens of letters and emails from people inspired by her actions. One letter stood out in particular, written by a young law student who had attended the trial. "Dear Judge Hayes," it began, "I was in the gallery during the trial, and I want to thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. You've inspired me to pursue a career in law with integrity and respect for the justice system." For the victims of Raymond Foster's fraud, the trial marked a turning point. Many of them had felt powerless for years, watching their life savings disappear while Foster lived in luxury. Now, they finally had closure. In a local diner, two former employees of Foster's company sat discussing the trial. "She didn't just hold Foster accountable," one of them said, stirring his coffee. "She made it clear that no one is above the law, not even his hotshot lawyer." The other nodded. "It's about time someone stood up to people like that. Judge Hayes didn't just deliver a sentence, she delivered a message." For Susan Caldwell, the prosecutor, the trial was a professional triumph. In an interview with a local news station, she reflected on the experience. "It wasn't an easy case," she admitted, "but justice was served because of Judge Hayes's leadership. Her ability to remain calm and focused set the tone for the entire trial." As for David, the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. The State Bar Association launched an investigation into his conduct, citing multiple instances of contempt and unprofessional behavior. Legal experts speculated that he could face suspension or even disbarment. For the first time in his career, David was forced to confront the reality of his arrogance. Sitting alone in his office late one night, he replayed the trial in his mind. He thought about the moments when Judge Hayes had given him chances to correct his behavior, chances he had squandered with every sarcastic remark and baseless objection. A small part of him, buried beneath layers of ego, began to acknowledge the truth. Judge Hayes had been right. His actions had not only failed his client, but had undermined the very principles of justice he claimed to uphold. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes returned to her routine, presiding over cases with the same calm authority that had defined her career. She rarely spoke about the trial publicly, but those who knew her sensed that it had left a lasting impact. One afternoon, as she prepared for a new case, her clerk entered the chambers with a small package. Inside was a handwritten note from a group of Foster's victims. "Thank you for standing up for us," it read. "You didn't just give us justice, you gave us hope." Judge Hayes smiled softly as she placed the note on her desk. For her, the trial wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about reinforcing the values that made the justice system a cornerstone of society: fairness, integrity, and respect. The story of the trial continued to spark conversations long after the verdict. In podcasts, blogs, and social media posts, people debated the importance of professionalism, the role of arrogance in failure, and the enduring power of calm, principled leadership. For many, the lesson was clear. Arrogance and disrespect might win attention in the short term, but they can never outlast the strength of integrity. The trial of Raymond Foster and the fallout from David Bryant's actions left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. For some, it was a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked arrogance. For others, it was an inspiring example of the power of integrity in leadership. At the center of it all stood Judge Eleanor Hayes, whose poise and unwavering commitment to justice turned what could have been a chaotic trial into a powerful lesson about respect and accountability. One of the clearest lessons from the trial was the importance of professionalism, particularly in positions of authority. David Bryant's behavior highlighted what happens when ego overshadows responsibility. His constant interruptions, sarcastic remarks, and open disrespect not only undermined his client's defense, but also disrupted the court's ability to function effectively. By contrast, Judge Hayes demonstrated that true authority doesn't come from volume or aggression. It comes from self-control, fairness, and a steadfast adherence to principles. Her handling of the trial sent a clear message: respect is not optional in the pursuit of justice. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Hayes gave David multiple opportunities to correct his behavior. Each time she addressed him calmly but firmly, maintaining her dignity even as he tested her patience. When he refused to change, she held him accountable, not out of spite, but because maintaining the integrity of the courtroom demanded it. This lesson resonated deeply with those in the gallery. Spectators who had initially viewed the trial as a spectacle left with a newfound appreciation for the values Judge Hayes upheld. One attendee, reflecting on the experience, noted, "She didn't just teach David a lesson, she reminded all of us that respect is the foundation of justice." For the victims of Foster's fraud, Judge Hayes's actions went beyond delivering a verdict. Her ability to maintain order in the face of chaos gave them a sense of closure and validation. Many of them had spent years feeling powerless, their lives upended by Foster's schemes. Seeing him held accountable and witnessing David's arrogance dismantled helped restore their faith in the justice system. The trial also sparked broader conversations about accountability in professional settings. Podcasts and opinion pieces discussed how arrogance can derail not just individual careers, but entire institutions. Many drew parallels between David's behavior and issues in other fields, emphasizing the importance of humility and respect across all professions. For Judge Hayes, the trial was a reminder of why she had chosen her career in the first place. In her chambers after the verdict, she reflected on the challenges of the case. She knew it wasn't the first time she had faced arrogance in her courtroom, and it wouldn't be the last. But she also knew that every time she upheld the principles of justice, she was making a difference, not just for the immediate parties involved, but for everyone who looked to the courts for fairness and accountability. The story of the trial became a symbol of what it means to lead with integrity. Judge Hayes's calm resolve stood in stark contrast to David's bluster, proving that dignity and respect are far more powerful than arrogance and entitlement. For those who followed the trial, the lesson was clear. Respect isn't just about how we treat others, it's a reflection of who we are and what we stand for. The trial of Raymond Foster wasn't just a story about one man's downfall or a lawyer's arrogance. It was a wake-up call about the importance of respect, accountability, and professionalism in every facet of life. Judge Eleanor Hayes's actions in the courtroom went beyond delivering justice for the victims. They highlighted the profound impact of integrity and calm leadership in even the most challenging situations. This story challenges us to ask important questions about our own behavior and the world we want to create. How do we respond when faced with disrespect? Do we let frustration guide our actions, or do we stand firm with dignity, as Judge Hayes did? Her ability to rise above David Bryant's arrogance and maintain order in her courtroom wasn't just a victory for justice. It was a lesson in strength, composure, and the power of holding others accountable. The lesson Judge Hayes imparted isn't limited to the courtroom. It applies to all areas of life: workplaces, schools, families, and communities. Respect isn't just something that's earned. It's something we owe each other as human beings. It's the foundation of trust and collaboration, and when it's absent, chaos and harm follow. David Bryant's behavior is a reminder of how arrogance can lead to failure. His refusal to show respect for the courtroom, the process, or even his own client ultimately backfired, tarnishing his career and damaging his reputation. It's a stark example of how unchecked ego can be destructive, not just to oneself, but to everyone around them. But this story is also a call to action for all of us to embody the values that Judge Hayes demonstrated. Accountability isn't just about pointing out the faults of others. It's about holding ourselves to high standards and being willing to confront uncomfortable truths. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. For those who have ever felt powerless in the face of disrespect or injustice, this story offers a reminder. You don't need to shout or stoop to the level of those who wrong you. Strength lies in maintaining your composure and letting your actions speak louder than words. So, what role will you play in fostering a culture of respect and accountability? Will you be the person who stands by and watches when someone disrespects others? Or will you be the one who steps up, like Judge Hayes, to ensure fairness prevails? Share this story with those who need a reminder about the importance of dignity and humility. Talk about it with friends and family and reflect on how you can bring these values into your own life. And remember, respect isn't just about following rules. It's about recognizing the humanity in others, even when they challenge yours. It's about making choices that uphold fairness and integrity, no matter how difficult the situation may be. If this story inspired you or gave you something to think about, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, discuss it, and be the change you wish to see in the world.